Hello, this is lecture 2 of the Romantic Era. Last time in lecture 1 I talked about Romanticism as a cultural movement which is much bigger than just music or even the arts. Talked a little bit about the historical background and started to get into the musical characteristics. And I think where I left off, I said that maybe the easiest way to think about how musical characteristics are different in this era compared to the previous era, the classical era, is to just take any of the elements of music or the parameters of music and kind of expand the possible range. So I think where I left off was talking about here on page 224, by the way, in the Kamian text, expanded range of dynamics, pitch, and tempo. So dynamics from loud to soft. And I think I mentioned how this was in part made possible by the expansion of the orchestra, which essentially doubled in size over the course of the Romantic era compared to what it had been in the classical era. And remember, in the classical era, the orchestra doubled in size over what it was in the Baroque. So the orchestra, having started out in the Baroque as mostly just the bowed stringed instruments plus harpsichord, right? We move into the classical era, the harpsichord goes away, but we add pairs of woodwinds and brass instruments and a pair of timpani. Now we move into the Romantic era, and we have many additional instruments. So, for example, in the woodwinds, we have like the piccolo is standard in the orchestra now, the English horn, the contrabassoon, the bass clarinet, and in the brass we have the trombones now standard in the orchestra, first used in orchestral music by Beethoven, by the way, the last movement of his Fifth Symphony. We have tuba, additional French horns, sometimes euphonium, and we have the harp, usually a pair of harps in a modern orchestra, and a whole battery of additional percussion instruments. So, especially when you consider about those brass and percussion instruments, you have the possibility for much louder sounds than is possible with a classical orchestra. You can still have very, very soft sounds, so the range is broadened. The range of pitch as well. So, for example, I mentioned the piccolo, very high instrument, not usually found in the classical orchestra, but now standard in the Romantic orchestra. You have the contrabassoon and the tuba, very low-pitched instruments. And by the way, this applies to the piano as well. I think I mentioned as well, so a little bit of review. The piano reaches its final evolution in the Romantic era, whereas the classical pianos, depending on when exactly you look, because the piano was evolving during the classical era, many pianos did not have metal in the frames. They just had a wooden frame, maybe with some metal bracing in there. And with a wooden frame, you can't have as much tension on the strings. You can't have as many strings. But we move into the 19th century, and the cast iron frame, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, becomes standard on the piano. And with a cast iron frame, you can have more strings. You can have strings under greater tension. Therefore, you can have a wider dynamic range and a wider range of notes. So the Romantic piano has some additional notes on either end compared to the classical era piano. Expanded range of tempo as well. So composers are interested in very slow tempos very often, but sometimes very fast tempos. And very fast tempos ties into another aspect of Romanticism, which is this sort of craze for virtuosity, for performers who have sort of superhuman technical abilities at a level that we just didn't see in previous eras. Performers like Niccolò Paganini and Franz Liszt and many others. And audiences were fascinated by virtuosity, by this kind of technical skill. The book also mentions colorful harmony. So maybe the way to think about this is think of harmony, the practice of harmony, as being sort of like language. It's not exactly like language, but it's similar enough. In Western music, since roughly the middle of the 16th century, certainly by the time we get to the Baroque, there has been this sort of accepted practice of harmony, which I've referred to before as common practice tonal harmony. The idea of you are in a certain key, like the key of C or the key of F, and you are going to use predominantly one of two different scales, either the major scale or the minor scale. So you could be in C major or F minor, right? And over the course of a composition, you might modulate. You might start out in C major, and then for a little while you might be in G major, and then you might go to D minor and A minor or whatever. You might travel through different keys, but eventually you will end in the same key that you began in. And this is a practice that has been going on now for hundreds of years, that is sort of like a commonly accepted and understood language, quote unquote. And within that language, you have chords that have certain functions, sort of like parts of speech, right? In speech, in language, we have nouns, we have adjectives, we have verbs, we have adverbs, we have modifiers, whatever. We have something similar to that in harmony. Chords have certain functions. Certain chords are understood to lead to certain other chords, but not to certain other chords. So it's sort of a rules-based system, sort of like language. But as we move into the 19th century, composers are more willing to experiment, to sort of bend or break these rules, to use chords in unconventional ways, and to modulate to keys that are farther away, rather than like hopscotching through closely related keys, as you would probably find in a classical composition, like going from one key to another key which shares many of the same pitches, right, which is not too distant in the sort of key universe. In the Romantic era, composers deliberately go directly to distant keys, and it's a very sort of a novel effect. It's like the difference between walking to your next door neighbor's house and then from there across the street, to another house within the same neighborhood, and sort of being teleported to another country, another dimension altogether. And they mention specifically chromatic harmony. Chromatic literally means colorful, but it means using pitches that are outside of the key or scale that you find yourself in, right? And if you choose to use pitches that are outside of the key that you have established that you are in, those notes will have a certain color. They will be chromatic. So it's sort of like, maybe to use another analogy, to like painting, having more colors on your palette to choose from. I think I might have used that same analogy in talking about orchestration, right? Orchestration now becomes, with all the additional instruments available in the orchestra and the combinations that can be created to create really kind of unique sounds, orchestration becomes sort of an art form within music. So that again, I think I probably used the analogy of a palette, a painter having colors and being able to mix colors that were previously unavailable. The same can be said about form. And by form, I mean more, the book uses the word form. It might be better to say genre. So we have certain genres of music that are, we've always had genres of music that are, let's say, shorter in length, right? Because music exists in time, not really in space, right? Genres that are shorter in length, that are sort of like miniatures, and then larger works. Well, composers in the 19th century are interested in the most concentrated miniatures. Sometimes, like some of the greatest works of the 19th century are only 2 minutes long. But also, on the other end, monumental works, especially symphonies and operas. So, as in so many areas, Beethoven was kind of the pace setter in this area. Remember, when I talked about Beethoven, his third symphony, the Eroica Symphony, which was composed right around 1802, 1803, was the first work of his middle period, the period of his works with all this storm and stress that we associate with Beethoven. That third symphony was twice as long as any previous symphony by, let's say, Mozart or Haydn or even Beethoven himself, his previous two symphonies. So this is a trend that kind of, as with so many, Beethoven set the example for. When we move into the 19th century, there are symphonies that are even twice as long as the Eroica, like symphonies by Mahler, for example. Now, we're not going to have time to get to Mahler. He's a late Romantic composer, but there are others who are, we will get to, in fact, just maybe next lecture, I think, Hector Berlioz, whose Symphonie Fantastique is 5 movements instead of 4, and is longer than any Beethoven symphony. It's not twice as long, but it's pretty long. It's big. It requires a huge orchestra, right? So this is another trend. See, composers either specializing in miniatures that sort of like pack a lot of emotion, a lot of drama, a lot of meaning into something that's very brief, sort of like the way a great writer might write a poem that's only 4 or 8 lines but packs a lot in there, as opposed to writing, War and Peace or some massive novel or play or something like this. Of course, we still have pieces of in-between length, but we see the extremes, the envelope being pushed on either end in any of the parameters of music. Okay, let's move on to this section on Romantic composers and their public. And we've had a section like this in most of the previous chapters where, we talk about the role of the composer, like how do they make their living, who is paying for the music, who is enjoying it. And what I'm going to talk about here, this, again, trends were set in motion in the classical era that we can follow kind of over the career of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. So if you recall, Haydn, the oldest of the 3 classical era composers, had mostly the kind of traditional career that a composer, really the best that a composer could hope for, either of the early classical period or certainly the Baroque or even the Renaissance. And that is to be a court composer working for some very wealthy, powerful, noble family. That would have been kind of like the top job to get. There's also the possibility of church jobs. So, for example, J.S. Bach, the last 27 years of his life, was a church musician. And although he did also work as a court composer for a couple of jobs previous to that, there really wasn't such a thing as a freelance composer. At least the examples are few and far between. Handel, you could argue, was a freelance composer for a while, although he had this issue where his opera house failed and he went bankrupt for a while. So it was a difficult thing to do. Anyway, Haydn had that kind of traditional career. Mozart, his father had that exact type of career as a court composer to a prince archbishop. But Mozart kind of chafed against this. Remember, having been a child prodigy, having been a superstar at a young age, it was kind of difficult to transition into this job of essentially being a servant, being on the staff of some high and mighty nobleman. So he kind of rebelled against this, had problems with his boss, and decided to break out and have a freelance career in the last 10 years of his life, of his short life. And over those 10 years, he had some good years and then some bad years, had some difficulties, maybe some of it essentially because of his own personality. Of course, a great composer, but maybe not so great at managing the business side, also managing his own expenses, etc., etc. Beethoven is considered the first truly freelance composer and was successful at it. Never in his adult life did Beethoven have a patron that he had to work for who was telling him what kind of music to compose and on a deadline and, I want to hear a symphony next week. And like, yes, sir, I'll get right on that. Beethoven Had none of that. And this is a reflection of how society is changing. So recall that the in the previous two eras, really, the Baroque and the Renaissance before, this is the time when the nobility are sort of on the rise, reaching the peak of their power and wealth, let's say during the age of absolutism, right? The Baroque era, the 18th century. And then we see a change as the middle class begins to grow larger, better educated, more prosperous. They begin to demand their rights, and the pace is different in different places. In France, of course, you have a revolution, and then there are revolutions. There are other revolutions in the 19th century, but the overall trend is towards the middle class rising in prosperity, and also remember urbanization, right? So I talked about how during the Industrial Revolution, during the late 1700s and throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, the cities are doubling, tripling, quadrupling in size, right? And it's essentially, middle and lower class people moving into the cities and looking for jobs, and because they are no longer needed in as great numbers out in the countryside. Agriculture is becoming more modern, more efficient. So that means that if you are a prince, let's say, you don't necessarily need to have your own orchestra and your own composer in residence in your palace out in the countryside, which is what Haydn's situation was with the Esterházy family. First of all, a lot of these nobles are aware of this sort of this resentment on the part of the middle and lower classes, and they don't want to be overly conspicuous in their displays of wealth. They don't want to cause any more agitation than is maybe already the case. And so many of them are cutting back on, they don't have the same, magnificent palaces necessarily that they once had. But even if they do, it just doesn't make any economic sense anymore. Why would you, hire 50, 60 musicians and a composer and have to deal with, you have to pay for all the instruments and the music and the upkeep of the concert hall in your palace? Why not just have a house in the city? You have and many of them already had a house in the city. You have a house in the city, you have a country house, and when you're in the city, you go to the public concerts like everybody else does. Maybe you get a nice box seat reserved just for you and your family. You'll save a ton of money. And after all, this is also the time when, in all these large cities now that are doubling, tripling in size, you have the establishment of symphony orchestras that are like a fixture within the city, right? So the London Symphony Orchestra, the Vienna Symphony, right? The Boston Symphony, the New York Symphony, whatever, right? So this is a new feature as we move into the 19th century. The idea that if you have a city, there's an orchestra called the, Pittsburgh Symphony. And in fact, there might be more than one orchestra in a given city, as there are today. There's usually one sort of like major league, and then there's some other smaller orchestras, maybe also choirs, opera houses, right? Because the demand is there, because all of these people are moving into the cities, right? There's enough of an audience to sustain, a subscription concert series, by an orchestra playing maybe a concert every week or every other week for the entire concert season, right? So, and this raises another issue that the book talks about in this section. If you're going to have a big orchestra in every major city, and maybe some smaller orchestras as well, where are all these musicians going to come from? And there's suddenly much more demand, right? Well, where they are now starting to come from increasingly is conservatories. So a conservatory is simply a music school. And interestingly, actually, the term conservatory, when you hear it, you might think, oh, isn't that a place where they have like lots of different kinds of plants or whatever? That's also another meaning of conservatory. But the kind that we're talking about, the word conservatory, which today means music school, originally meant an orphanage. Think back to Vivaldi. Remember, what did Vivaldi do for a living? He taught music at an orphanage. And actually, most of the girls there weren't really orphans. They were born out of wedlock. But what do you do with these orphans? You teach them music. In addition to other things, of course, teach them other things as well. But in the case of these girls who didn't have families, if you could make them into excellent musicians, it made them that much more attractive as potential brides, and then they could marry, and life would be better for them than it otherwise would have been. So the word conservatory goes from meaning essentially an orphanage to a music school. And conservatories begin popping up all over Europe. One of our composers that we'll get to, Felix Mendelssohn, founded a conservatory. And so now, instead of being trained in the old way, I mean, how were composers trained before? It was sort of a master-apprentice type situation, right? And very often it was sort of like the family business. And therefore, you might train with your father, with your older brothers, or whatever. That's how J.S. Bach learned. That's how Mozart learned from his own father. To a certain extent, Beethoven, his father was a professional musician, although he was really more of a professional alcoholic. But he, too, was from a musical family. His grandfather was a composer, right? So that was more the typical situation, was if you were a professional musician, up until this time, let's say throughout the 17th, 18th centuries, and probably before, it was likely because that was sort of like the family business, just like everything else. If you were a blacksmith, it was probably because your father was a blacksmith. But now, that's not so much the case. In fact, all of the composers that we are going to look at in this unit, and we're only going to get about halfway through the Romantic era before we run out of time. But almost all of these composers did not come from families of professional musicians. Right? The only exception really is Clara Schumann. Her father was a piano teacher. But all the rest of them, so our first composer we will look at, Schubert, his father was a school teacher, school principal really. Hector Berlioz, his father was a doctor, wanted his son to become a doctor. Robert Schumann, his father was a bookseller and publisher, wanted his son to maybe grow up to be a lawyer. Didn't work out that way. Frédéric Chopin's father was a teacher of French language in Poland. Franz Liszt's father worked for the Esterházy family, but not as a musician. He was sort of I think his title was, he was a farm steward. He had to manage the flocks of sheep, I believe, that were owned by the Esterházys. So in each case, these composers came from basically middle-class families of non-musicians, maybe amateur musicians, but not professional musicians. So that's a definite change compared to what was typical earlier on. Let's see what else the book says. It says here, Romantic composers wrote primarily for a middle-class audience whose size and prosperity had increased because of the Industrial Revolution. Right? So they're not necessarily writing for the elite anymore, because that's not where the money is going to be. I mean, to put it in crass terms, the audience is middle class people. Remember, there are still far more working people, whether middle class or maybe lower class, whatever, than there are nobility. The nobility is still a very small segment of the population. It's just that in previous eras, it was the nobility, or before that the church, that were the patrons of music. They were the people who were paying for, who wanted music. And the working people, they didn't have the time or the money or the opportunity or whatever. They were just peasants, right? But if we're seeing now this massive shift, this industrialization, where we no longer have primarily an agrarian society, right, where we don't need as many people to, I mean, we still need farmers, but we don't need the bulk of the population to be raising crops. Those people are moving to the cities, and often, they're making enough money that they can go to a concert once in a while. Maybe they can buy a piano for their house, and maybe pay for music lessons for their children, right? This is the time also where the piano was certainly the most important instrument of the 19th century, but not just for professional musicians. The piano in those days was the home entertainment system of the 19th century. And if you walked into any middle class or higher, let's say, I mean, if you were really, working poor, you probably couldn't afford a piano, might not have space for a piano. But anything higher than that, it would just be assumed that there would be a piano in the house. It would be like walking to a house today and not seeing a TV set, right? It would be assumed that there would be a piano, and there would be someone in the family, at least one person, who could play it pretty well. It wasn't just there to hold up picture frames or knickknacks or whatever, right? And again, as we've seen in previous eras, women in particular were expected to be proficient amateur musicians, but not necessarily professionals. Now, this does start to change over the 19th century. We do start to see more women who are performers, maybe not necessarily as many composers. If they are composers, maybe they are composing under an assumed name, as for example, Felix Mendelssohn's sister, Fanny Mendelssohn, had some of her works published under her brother's name, because she knew that if she submitted them to a publishing house, it's by a woman, So that does start to change, but it's a very slow process. Men were it was only men who were going to be like professional composers or conductors, and usually also like orchestra musicians. If you went to an orchestral concert in the 19th century, everyone on stage would be a man. In fact, I believe the Berlin Philharmonic, I think, only started allowing women into the orchestra in the early 90s. I think it was 1994, which seems kind of hilarious today. But that was just kind of the way it was back then. Women were expected to be proficient amateur musicians, and by amateur I don't mean like they're just so-so. I mean they're just doing it non-professionally, but they could be, some of them were as good as the professionals. But only men really could be, for the most part, could be professional composers, certainly, and for performers as well, it was overwhelmingly men. Anyway, moving on. Let's see what else they say. They talk about subscription concert series, about orchestras being, established in different cities. We talked about that. The 19th century public was captivated by virtuosity. I talked about that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, especially when we get to Franz Liszt, the greatest pianist of the 19th century, and some would say of all time. Private music making also increased during the Romantic era. The piano became a fixture in many middle-class homes. Talked about this. All right, I think I've covered all of that Romantic composers and their public stuff. I'm just going to continue on in the order that the book presents. And the next thing they talk about is the art song. So in this unit, we will not need to talk about too many new forms or genres of music. So remember, I make this distinction between form and genre, right? And form is the way that a piece is constructed. Different sections presented in some kind of way that gives us a balance between continuity and variety, your A section, your B section, this kind of thing. Genre is like if we're talking about a sonata versus a string quartet versus a symphony versus opera versus oratorio. Those are genres. And as far as form goes, I think I made this point last time, but I'll make it again. Romantic composers mostly continued on with the same forms that we talked about back in the classical era. Sonata form, rondo form, ternary form, that's ABA. Because the Romantic composers were not, for the most part, that much interested in form as a thing on its own. They were more interested in the content, right? Very different idea from the classical composer. The classical composer, I would say, or let's say the classically minded artist generally, believes that beauty arises from form, right? And form is maybe the most important thing. The Romantic composer would say, "Oh, that's a bunch of abstract, highfalutin, nonsense. Sure, we have to have a form, but the form isn't really that important. That's not what causes you to either weep or to causes your heart to it's the content, right? It's not so much the form." So Romantic composers continue to use the forms that they themselves, experienced, learned about from their teachers, whatever. We do have a couple of new genres to talk about. One of them is the art song. One of them is the character piece. And another one is the symphonic poem. Those are the only three, really, that I would say we're going to need to worry about. All right. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what these are, and then I'm going to go into more detail on what an art song is, and that will lead us into our first composer, Franz Schubert. I'll start with a character piece. What is a character piece? It is a brief, single movement work, usually for piano. Could be for other instruments, but piano was the most important instrument of the 19th century. A brief, single movement work for an instrument, usually piano, that has some kind of a descriptive title. A title not like sonata or rondo, right? It's a title that gives you something to imagine that the music is about, right? So it might be something like nocturne, right? A nocturne has something to do with night. It's a night piece, right? Or it might have a title that has to do with dance, like a waltz or mazurka or polonaise. These are all titles of works by Chopin. Chopin is the master of the character piece. I mean, there are other composers who, like Schubert, our first composer that we'll talk about, composed many, many wonderful character pieces. But this is something that is kind of new. Beethoven did compose some character pieces, but that wasn't the main thrust of his writing for piano. His main works for piano are his sonatas. He wrote 32 sonatas, also wrote some themes and variations, and that's like the meat and potatoes of his piano music. And sonatas, as we know, are sort of big multi-movement pieces. The title, sonata, it's kind of abstract. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not suggesting something to you to like, oh, this piece is about whatever, right? It's just a sort of a bureaucratic title, sonata. You could put on a stamp, right? But in the 19th century, composers are, again, they're catering to their audience's expectations. The audience kind of wants to know what they're supposed to be feeling, because it's all about feeling in the 19th century, right? So again, it could be a description of a type of dance, it could be a description of a mood, or it could be something like, an afternoon by the lake, or whatever. It could be something that's like a picture. It could be that specific, and some composers favored more specific descriptive titles. Some, like Chopin, were content to have suggestive titles, but not that specific, right? So there are degrees, but either way, a character piece always has some kind of a descriptive title. It is short, it's a miniature, and it's a single movement piece. We'll talk about some examples of character pieces in a future lecture. A symphonic poem. Now, this is a genre that is more or less invented by Franz Liszt, although there are other types of orchestral pieces by other composers that are kind of similar in conception. But he was the first to compose these pieces that he called symphonic poems. And a symphonic poem is kind of like a character piece, but for orchestra. Now, it's going to be a little bit longer. It might be 10, 15 minutes long instead of, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes long, a typical character piece. But it also has a descriptive title, and it's a single movement piece. And in the case of Franz Liszt, the title might suggest some kind of inspiration from history or literature or poetry or the visual arts. Making connections to the other arts is something that certain Romantic composers like to do, again, because that's what appealed to their audience. The audience didn't just want to see a title like Symphony Number 2 or Sonata in E flat. They wanted something that would kind of grab their imagination and suggest what it is that they should be feeling or experiencing or visualizing as they listen to the piece. Okay, so now let's talk about the art song. Now, throughout this course, I've stressed a couple of times that you should not think of all these different types of pieces, types of compositions, as songs. This is a problem. We grow up listening to popular music, everything is a song. And so we kind of use that word song for any piece of music. But, as I've said, like a Beethoven symphony is not a song, right? It's a symphony. A Bach fugue is not a song, it's a fugue, right? So we have specific titles for different types of pieces. And we haven't really talked about songs that much. Now, we've talked about other types of vocal music, like opera and motets or oratorios or, madrigals, for example. Now, a madrigal is maybe a type of song, but we call it a madrigal. We don't call it a song. Now, we did talk about like troubadour songs, and for that we actually did use the word song. We talked about the lute songs, like John Dowland, but we haven't really talked that much about songs. Well, now we are getting into the golden age of songs, which is the 19th century. And our first composer we're going to talk about is generally considered to be the greatest composer of songs, period. And you might have thought that, well, wait a minute, I thought it was like Lennon and McCartney. No, it's not. It's Franz Schubert. We'll get to him in a minute. Let's talk about what an art song is. First of all, the word art song, I guess somebody came up with that to distinguish between popular songs and art song, classical songs. It's kind of artificial. Nobody back in these days called them art songs. They just called them songs. And only now, when we have, I think, this distinction between popular culture and like high art culture, do we call it an art song. But it's something that is not that difficult to understand. It's simply for a singer and usually piano. Now, there were some later Romantic composers composed songs for singer and orchestra, but the kind that we're going to talk about is for singer and piano. These are relatively short, maybe between 2 and 5 minutes long, usually. And as we've seen in most of the other types of songs or vocal music that we've studied, the words are not written by the composer. The composer takes a pre-existing poem and sets it to music. And it just so happens that the greatest composers of these types of songs happen to be German. Now, there were obviously, people writing these kinds of songs in France or in Italy or in Spain or in England or whatever, but it's generally acknowledged that the greatest songwriters in classical music, certainly of the 19th century, were all German speakers, and they are, in order, Franz Schubert, definitely the greatest song composer. I think number 2 is Robert Schumann. Now, Schubert was Austrian, Schumann was German. Number 3, perhaps, Johannes Brahms, also German. Number 4, Hugo Wolf, also German, right? And because these composers were all German, they tended to choose poetry in the German language. And very often we just use the German word for song, which is Lied. L-I-E-D, and the D is kind of pronounced as a T, but we can say lead if you want. And when we talk about German songs, definitely we talk about Lied, and in the plural, it's actually Lieder. You stick an er on the end of the German word to make it plural. And the poetry for these songs very often was by one of two or three different poets. They mention specifically Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who was kind of like the greatest German literary figure. Basically, what Shakespeare is to the English language, Goethe is to the German language. And as you can see, now he lived much later than Shakespeare. Very interesting lifespan, 1749 to 1832. Basically, exactly the span of the classical era. Goethe was actually a close friend of Beethoven. And another great poet, Heinrich Heine, who lived a little later, actually born the very same year as Schubert, 1797, although he lived quite a bit longer, lived up to 1856. These two and several others were among the most popular poets for these songwriters in the German language. Sometimes they would also compose, German translations of like Shakespeare or whatever. But when we think of art song, it's certainly the Germans that sort of dominated this field. What were these songs about? Well, as you can imagine, many of them were love songs, but they were very often not like happily ever after love, because that's boring, let's face it. It's always about some kind of, not always, but very often like yearning after some, it's love gone bad or love that's unattainable, sort of like the troubadour songs, remember, right? And there's also very often strong, there's nature imagery. Remember, the Romantics are obsessed with nature. So there's very often nature in there. There's a scene in the woods or by a brook or whatever. And often also there might be some kind of supernatural element. And we are definitely going to see this in the example of this song by Franz Schubert that we will look at. The piano often plays an important role as sort of setting the mood and illustrating subtly things that might be happening in the text, right? But it's definitely the piano is in an accompanying role, and the singer is obviously the main focus. As far as the form of these songs, they talk about two types. Basically, a song like this can either be strophic or it can be through composed, or maybe somewhere in between. Strophic simply means that the music repeats and you have different verses where the words change. Sort of like a hymn, right? If you're in church and you look at the hymnal, you can see it's the same music, but there's maybe 4 or 5 different verses, and you go back to the top and you sing it with the different words, right? Christmas carols are like this, patriotic songs are like this, they are strophic. The music repeats, but the words change with each verse. If you don't have that kind of a structure, if the music isn't repeating as the words go on, then you have some kind of through composed. Through composed is kind of a grab bag term. It just basically means not strophic. It's in some other form. However, it's possible, and we'll see this in the song that we will listen to here, the Erlking by Schubert, it's possible to have something that's kind of in between, where some of the music repeats, but not exact repetition like you'd find in a hymn, right? It's not like we go back and we sing exactly the same notes, right? There might be some differences, but material is brought back, right? They also talk about the possibility of a song cycle. So a song cycle is when a composer composes a set of songs, let's say 12, 15, 20 songs, and each of the songs is related to some overarching story, right? Now, this is usually not the case. Composers did not usually compose songs in song cycles. Usually it's just an isolated, the song is kind of its own thing. But sometimes there's an overall story that is told over the course of the song. Sort of like in the 70s, there's very popular in rock music, the concept album, like Pink Floyd The Wall, right? Which they even made a movie out of. So there are many different songs, and sometimes you hear a single on the radio from The Wall. But if you listen to the whole album, it's sort of like telling a story, and each of the songs is sort of one little chapter in that story. So that's what a song cycle is. Okay, so let's talk about our first composer of the Romantic era and the greatest composer of songs, although he composed all different types of music, not just songs. And that is Franz Schubert. And if you see, the first thing to think about here is the dates of his life, 1797 to 1828. Very short life, died at age 31. Even Mozart made it all the way to 35. But Schubert died at 31. And notice also that his life is almost completely in what we would consider to be the classical era, right? The classical era goes, according to the book, all the way up to 1820. And so most of Schubert's life was within the classical period. Beethoven died in 1827. Schubert died the next year, much younger though, at 1828. So why don't we consider Schubert to be a classical composer? Well, this is where these distinctions kind of break down. Remember, this classification system, it's useful, but it's not absolute. Right? It's something that we invent and kind of overlay on history in order to try and make some sense of it. And I think it's fair to say that both Schubert and Beethoven sort of have one foot in each era, right? But in the case of Schubert, there's so many aspects of his music that are pointing the way into sort of like the future, into the 19th century, although he's also rooted in the past. I mean, he composed all the different genres the same way that Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven did. He didn't specialize the way that we will see. Many Romantic composers tended to specialize in maybe a couple of things. Like Chopin really only wrote piano music. That's all he was interested in. Berlioz only wrote monumental orchestral pieces and some opera. He wasn't interested in piano music or string quartets or whatever. Schubert is more like the traditional 18th century composer in that he did it all. Now, he was better known for some things than others, or at least today he's better known for some things than others. He wasn't really known very well at all in his own time, unfortunately. And this is what maybe the most tragic thing about Schubert is he was hardly known at all outside of his own circle of friends in Vienna. I would say that, we've been talking about all these composers, and I think I've mentioned, for example, that J.S. Bach is considered by classical musicians to be the greatest composer of all time. Now, some people might say, oh, no, it's really Mozart or it's Beethoven, but usually those three, right, are the top three in whichever order, right? I would say that Schubert is arguably number 4, or maybe he's tied for number 4 with Brahms. That's my own personal choice, but he is up there with the greatest of the great. I think he is definitely. I think there's a good case to be made that he is number 4, and yet his whole life, practically, nobody ever heard of him, other than his own close friends, until the last couple years of his life. Now, maybe if he had lived longer, he would have had, he would have become big and famous, but only in the last couple of years of his life did he get any of his music published, or did he have any big public concerts. He only, he composed 9 symphonies, never got to hear any of them performed by a big professional orchestra, right? And this despite the fact that he was born and lived his entire life in Vienna, in the musical capital of Europe. Now, maybe part of the problem was he was, of course, in the shadow of Beethoven, who was famous and living in Vienna at that time. There's some dispute over, or let's say not dispute, but it's unclear whether the two of them ever really met. Or that they met formally. It's hard to believe that they didn't run into each other at some point, and Schubert was very aware of Beethoven. Any musician in Vienna would have been very, very aware of Beethoven. But Beethoven wouldn't necessarily have been aware of Schubert. Supposedly on Beethoven's deathbed, some of Schubert's music was brought to Beethoven. Like that's what you want on your deathbed, someone bringing you music to look at. And Beethoven had nice things to say about what he saw in Schubert's music. And Schubert was apparently like a torchbearer at Beethoven's funeral. Schubert had tremendous admiration for Beethoven, but it's not really clear if Beethoven was aware at all of Schubert. Anyway, let's start at the beginning. Schubert was born to a family who were good amateur musicians, but not professional musicians. Schubert's father was a school principal, but they had music in the house. You know, they were like these typical middle-class people who were musical, and apparently Schubert's father started to teach him violin when he was a little kid, and Schubert's older brother started to teach him piano, but within months, little Franz was better at violin than his father and better at piano than his brother, and they recognized that they had a genius on their hands. However, then as now, a career as a musician, like if you guys were to, call up your parents and say, guess what, I decided to drop out of college and become a musician, they might not be very pleased with that. And this is a pattern that we'll see with several of these composers. Schubert's father wanted his son to do something, that was kind of like a solid career, and what better than to be a school teacher? And in fact, Schubert did go to sort of like a teaching, I guess the equivalent of a teacher's college back then, and did work for a few years in his father's school. So his father was a school principal, so he could hire his own son as a teacher. But Schubert really hated school teaching, and what he loved more than anything was to compose. He would get up early in the morning, start composing. He said, when I finish one piece, I begin another. Schubert was extremely prolific. I mean, he composed a ton of stuff. So they mentioned that he composed 600 songs, and this is what he was best known for, is his songs. But in addition to all those songs, he composed dozens of piano sonatas. He composed 9 symphonies, the same number as Beethoven. Composed operas, composed tons of chamber music, string quartets, this kind of thing. Composed quite a bit of sacred music, masses, basically you name it, he composed it. And in the space of 31 years, it's astonishing how much he composed and how rapidly, how easily he could compose, sort of like Mozart in that sense. In fact, there's one funny episode that was recalled. Schubert, as the book mentions, his music was mostly performed in the presence of his friends in a living room someplace. He never made it big, like in the concert scene, for whatever reasons. But his close friends would get together and have what they called Schubertiads. A Schubertiad was just like a private house concert consisting of Schubert's music, and Schubert would play the piano, and people would sing or play the violin or whatever. And there was one occasion when Schubert's at the piano, and somebody kind of just grabbed a piece of music and plunked it down in front of him on the piano, and Schubert played through it and said, "Oh, this is pretty good. Who's the composer?" And his friend said, "You are." So Schubert composed so much music, sometimes he didn't even recognize a piece of his own music put in front of him. Any case, he composed nonstop, basically lived very often. He lived a very bohemian life, we would say. After he quit this teaching job, working for his father, he really never had any regular employment for very long. And often he would spend entire days in the cafe or in the park, and maybe crash on a friend's couch somewhere. He had some generous friends, some wealthy friends who recognized his talent and supported him. But he was pretty poor his entire life. Died at age 31. There's some controversy about whether he died from I think, typhoid or from syphilis. Syphilis was very common, unfortunately, in those days, mostly because single men, like Franz Schubert, tended to go to houses of prostitution. Beethoven did, Schubert did, Schumann did, Brahms did. That was just kind of like understood. That's what you did back then. Anyway, so tragically short life, and only after his death, really, did Schubert's music begin to be recognized and performed by other composers and other, like, conductors, let's say, and praised by other by music critics, for example. So it was people like Schumann, different composer. We'll talk about him in a couple of lectures. Schumann and Franz Liszt and Brahms and others who later championed Schubert's music began, for example, performing his symphonies, playing his piano music, playing his songs, but all of that unfortunately came too late for Schubert to enjoy any of it. If you ever go to Vienna, you can find Schubert's grave right next to Beethoven's grave. Anyway, let's talk about the example of a piece by Schubert which is in your book, and this is one of his best-known songs, the Erlking, or Erlkönig in German, written when he was 18 years old. This is one of the greatest songs in the classical repertoire, period. One of the most instantly recognizable and performed. It is a total masterpiece. The words are by Goethe, and it's a telling of a very old German legend, basically, of this character, the Erlking. I think this is a myth that goes back to the Middle Ages. Think of, in the Middle Ages, travel was very difficult. You know, much of Europe was covered by heavy forests. To go from one city to the next, you would have to ride through the forest. There are, wild animals and outlaws and who knows what. The Erlking was this mythical evil elf king who lived in the forest with his daughters. And travelers through the forest, especially children, I think in one version of the myth, only children can see the Erlking. Adults can't see him. And he's like a portent of death, okay? So in this poem, let's just talk about the poem first. There are 4 characters, and we only have one singer, so the singer has to sort of change his voice to assume these different characters. There's a narrator who opens up the song and also closes it. So we only hear from the narrator at the very beginning and the end. There's a father and a son. They're riding on a horse through the woods. The boy is probably, 5 or 6 years old. And he's small enough that the father is sort of like holding him, carrying him. And then there's the Erlking himself. So first, the narrator speaks, setting the scene for us. Who rides so late through the night and the wind? It is the father with his child. He holds the boy close in his arms. He clasps him securely. He holds him warmly. The father. Now, each time the father speaks, he has this low voice. My son, why do you hide your face so anxiously? The son speaks. The son, being a little boy, has a higher voice. Schubert is masterfully depicting these different characters by using the vocal range. He says, Father, don't you see the Erlking with his crown and his train? Train being like a long flowing garment, like a bridal train, I guess. The father says, my son, it is a streak of mist, right? So notice, they're in the woods, right? Nature. The romantics love nature. There's also something supernatural, something frightening out there. The child can see it, but the adult can't. The father sees a streak of mist, something that is natural, but the son sees something supernatural. The Erlking speaks, and each time the Erlking speaks, The piano, the mood becomes a little bit more playful and jaunty. Like the Errol King isn't really frightening in an obvious way. He's coaxing and beguiling. He says, "Dear child, come, go with me. I'll play the prettiest games with you. Many colored flowers grow along the shore. My mother has many golden garments." So he's trying to entice the kid back with him to his, sort of like the van driving around in your neighborhood, the guy, creepy guy, offering candy and Xbox. The son cries out, and each time the son it cries out when he sees or he hears the Errol King, it's at a higher pitch. It's getting more and more desperate and afraid. It's, my father, don't you hear the Errol King whispering promises to me?" The father says, "Be quiet, stay quiet, my child. It's just the wind rustling in the dead leaves." Errol King speaks again. "My handsome boy, will you come with me? My daughters shall wait upon you. My daughters lead off in the dance every night, and cradle and dance and sing you to sleep." And again, the mood is kind of playful. And the son cries out higher and louder than before, my father, don't you see there the Errol King's daughters in the shadows?" The father says, "My son, I see it clearly. The old willows look so gray. It's just willow trees, And this is naturally, of course, what a father would do. Like, there's no monster under your bed. It's just your imagination. Finally, the Errol King speaks one more time. He says, "I love you. Your beautiful figure delights me. And if you are not willing, then I shall use force." The son cries out one last time, my father, he's taken hold of me. The Errol King has hurt me." At this point, the narrator comes back in. It says, "The father shudders, he rides swiftly on. He holds in his arms the groaning child. He reaches the courtyard, weary and anxious." And then there's a pause. And the last line is just kind of half-spoken. It's recitative style. There's no piano. He sings, "In seinen Armen das Kind war tot." In his arms, the child was dead. Right? Now, is there really an Errol King? Did he sort of like zap the kid, or was the kid just kind of like, did he frighten himself to death seeing things that aren't there? It's ambiguous. It isn't 100% clear. That's kind of deliberate. You see this kind of thing in the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. We're not really sure if what we're seeing is reality or is it just all in the imagination of one of the characters. All right. One last thing I'll mention about this song. The piano part is ferociously difficult because what the pianist has to do is basically be the horse. So you have these galloping, repeated octaves throughout most of the piece in the right hand. It's very, very tiring. I've had to play this a couple occasions in concerts for singers and in rehearsal. You can get through it once, but if they say, "Can we try it again?" Like, you're going to have to give me a few minutes because it is just terrifically difficult, and especially towards the end, because at the end there's an accelerando where the narrator says, "The father shudders, he rides swiftly on." It's marked in the music. You have to even go faster. After having done this, for like 4 minutes. But then as they reach the courtyard, weary and anxious, you can hear the horses kind of slow down, come to a stop. And then, unfortunately, the child is dead. So we're out of time, so we won't listen to it here in the recording. But do listen to the Errol King. Follow along with the listening guide. And next time we will have some more supernatural, weird, frightening stuff from our next composer, Hector Berlioz. See you then.